I mean, listening and bringing the decibel level down and bringing the stridency down um, is absolutely key to going forward. And I think we are. I mean, I think gradually things are beginning. There's a kind of silent majority, if you will, to use an old political term, that's beginning to reassert itself.
So this is a disruptive time in the world around us. So how would you describe the issues that we face? And by the way, this is John Philip. And how would you like to describe yourself, John?
Well, I would say in terms of life, an actor and an attorney, someone interested in the civic issues of the United States as a citizen. I think those are the main things that apply. I think you just said a word, disruptive, that helps us understand where we are. Periods of disruption are as inevitable as changes in the weather. And what we are seeing in the United States right now has been brought on by an external issue. That's the coronavirus, granted, and a lot of social tensions that has exposed and brought to the surface. But this issue of coming to terms with some of the racial problems we have, and most specifically with the militarization of the police, which is an issue that has dogged us really since the Vietnam War. It's something that Senator Moynihan predicted and warned us about years ago, ironically, our own senator from New York. And so I can't see it as a negative that this has floated to the surface. I see this as a positive. It's something that we have to deal with. And I also think most of us are old enough now to have seen many cycles of this, where protest goes to violence, and then there's a reaction, and then finally there's a stabilized center that begins to establish itself. The difference I see with the Vietnam era, which I remember very well and to which I see tremendous similarities. I mean, to my mind, Vietnam was a kind of a COVID experience. What was happening in our youth was people were being killed. And the United States was involved in a terrifying war. And COVID is a terrifying experience too, that's sort of offshore. But what it's doing is it's bringing tremendous disruption, to use your word, into the American political mainstream. And it's not something we should be surprised by or flummoxed by. We've been through it many times. And we will come through this. I think, again, going to the racial issue first, I think it's amazing to me how quickly this has gone from protest to violence to already some legislation coming out and some positive change. Almost across the board, even President Trump has said that chokeholds should no longer be used, for instance. So this is a great, this is an important moment. It hasn't taken weeks and weeks. It hasn't taken endless discussion. The entire country, I think, and again, this goes right across the political schism. The entire country feels this was a murder, and that what happened to Floyd was a murder, and he's been indicted for murder, and I think he'll be tried for murder, and certainly going to have an extended sentence. So that's one thing. Now, but to go back for a moment to what is the external COVID, if you will. When this whole thing began, we really did have a model of how to deal with it in a different way than we adopted. We adopted this lockdown model. And even as we were doing that, there were countries, Sweden being a prominent example, that went a different way. And I think what's happened here, almost without notice, is that we've essentially become a Sweden. Most of the Western countries have finally decided that we can't live in perpetual lockdown. We do have to take every step we can to protect the elderly and the vulnerable and whatever, but we do have to open the economies. And the cost of not opening the economies is not only economic, and this is where I think the change in consciousness has come. It's spiritual, it's psychic. You know, you can't rob children of their education, which is effectively what has happened last year. You can't rob children of even the simplest of education, the ability to read. First graders in this country and all across the Western world are behind in the ability to read by a full semester. And that can't go on. These are the costs that really ricochet in people's minds. The fact that they can't visit a relative who's dying, the fact that they can't have a barbecue with friends. These are the things that have caused a new understanding of how we have to go forward. And it's not going to be easy. I mean, even today we're reading about spikes in cases in certain states and what have you. But I do think a very odd, rough consensus is beginning to be formed that we have to open up to some degree, we have to accept risk, and we have to keep working on a vaccine, which of course is the only answer in the long run.
So the major issues that I think we're talking about here are a combination of the impacts of the virus and how that has connected with our internal issue of race relations. Do you think that the race relations issue, you think that the reaction to it or the reappearance of it was somehow connected with the virus?
Oh, I do. I mean, I think first of all, on the basic level, the outbursts of violence were reflected in the fact that the lockdown was much harder on the poorer section of the population and less advantaged. People who didn't have country houses to go to, who didn't have suburban yards. And these are most of the people who showed up in these riots, as if you look at the demographics. These people were penned into their apartments. It was a very brutal thing that was done to many of these people for a very long time. I mean, one of the most brutal aspects of it, and that astonishes me that it was even considered, was closing down parks. I mean, thankfully that was reversed in many cases fairly quickly. But the fact it was even considered, which it was, and which was implemented, it is an indication of how really brutal these policies were on a sizable urban section of the population. And these are the people who burst into the streets rioting. So I think there was a factor there, but that's not the key factor, obviously. What the match that that lit the fire was something that was going to eventually light the fire. And that was police attitudes and tactics used in what they consider dangerous situations, which involve minorities more often than the majority white population.
Why do you feel that the police have developed in this fashion?
Well, that really gets me back to, I think, Senator Moynihan and a warning he gave years and years ago, which I think was as important as Eisenhower's warning about the military-industrial complex. Moynihan's point was that a country which engages in constant overseas military involvement invariably begins to acquire the aspects of what he called a garrison state. In other words, returning veterans, the volunteer army, the constant militarization of life, and the fact that we were engaged. I mean, it is astonishing to think, and I'm not someone who would rule out all interventions, but it is astonishing to think, Larry, in our lifetimes, that with the exception of the Carter years, and even then I don't know if certain special operations weren't being carried out, but with the exception of the Carter years, since the Vietnam War, we have almost invariably been involved in some sort of military operation overseas. So why does this connect to the police? Well, there's a one elemental thing, which is that very often, yeah, I mean, one sort of very elemental thing, which is very often veterans go into the police force.
Mhm.
So there's that. It's an attractive occupation for them, and of course they're welcomed into the police force because they already have training in a lot of the things that the police force needs. So that's number one. But I think it's more an attitude begins to develop of which is societal, that we must, quote, defend ourselves. I mean, the very fact that George Bush started to use the word homeland after 9/11. I mean, homeland is a term that has terrific negative implications if you look at history. And so once you start to think of yourself as a homeland, then you start to think of yourself as needing this protection. And it's not a far stretch to start to think of yourself as a suburb that needs the protection from inner city violence. I mean, these things become in people's minds linked. And then there's something that I read about recently, which I had not been aware of. I thought was the case, but I didn't directly know, is in the Clinton era, a huge amount of military surplus was offered to police departments around the country. And so police departments began taking on a military visage. You would see cops appearing in flak jackets, or what they call, bulletproof jackets, not like the bulletproof vests that people, in 1920s movies wore underneath their suit, but vast, great big, almost encasements and helmets that had visors and special things to prevent them getting gas attack. I mean, they look like frontline soldiers. They no longer look like police. And
like Buffalo, frankly. Like
sorry?
People of the policemen in Buffalo that were involved.
Yeah, well, almost every place you've seen. And this, by the way, I found it most curious. You began to see this being adopted in Europe too. In other words, the police tactics, even the police look, even the uniform look of American policemen began to be adopted, especially by the riot police in various countries, like France. I mean, they dressed more in military fatigue than they had dressed in, the policeman that you saw in the 1950s movies in the elegant French little uniform was gone. And now this guy had a t-shirt and a flak jacket. So, you say what caused this? I think this overextension in foreign affairs, this predisposition to military intervention. And also a very funny thing happened with the volunteer army. Once it was the volunteer army, it didn't hit us in the same way. We weren't sending our own troops to rescue somebody in Somalia. We were sending, effectively, we thought of them as volunteers. By saying we, I mean the educated class in America was no longer touched by the military. They weren't participant, but they also had this unfortunate ability now to disconnect from the fates of those people and say, okay, we'll send troops we'll say, Madeleine Albright's famous comment, which in the Clinton years was, well, what's the point of this military if we can't use it? Well, that's not really the point. The point is to protect yourself in the absolute last resort. You're not supposed to reach for the military as a first resort ever. And unfortunately, we did. I mean, it is one of the great ironies of the Trump administration that it is the first American administration in decades that has opted out of a foreign intervention in its first months of office, that being Syria. I mean, I can tell you my assessment is that had we gone into Syria, which was a widely discussed possibility, America's position today would be much worse than we are in, because we would have been locked into an intractable war, which would have very quickly taken on Cold War implications. We would have Russia on one side, we would have us on the other. It would have been it would have Vietnam times several exponential points. So we did avoid, there's one way we're not in as bad a situation as we could. We're not involved in any major overseas war right now.
Well,
which is good.
part of Trump's philosophy that we shouldn't be involved in the.
I know it's one of the great ironies. You see, you used the word disruption before, and this is a key thing that Trump's I believe that when we look back, has nothing to do whether you voted for him or not. It's not the point. This Trump 4 years has been a tremendous disruption that was needed in an awful lot of areas of American life. And one was a great predisposition on the part of, the word deep state is used. It's not really a deep state. It's many, many patriotic people with a similar mindset. And these people with a similar mindset believed that we should intervene militarily in a variety of situations which really were not prudent. We had forgotten George Washington's famous dictum, do not involve yourselves. Doesn't mean they might be right. It might be the right cause. It might be too bad. It might be sad. It might be tragic that in Syria, a dictator rules, but it is not prudent for us to be involved. It was not prudent for us to be involved in so many things. And the blowback is that in our own society, we've seen this militarization. And now it comes home to haunt us with what happened with the Floyd murder. I mean, that.
You're bringing up another issue, which is the Trump administration in a broader sense. What is your view of the Trump administration on a number of issues?
Well, I think it's not about defending it or being part of it. I didn't vote for Trump, but I think there have been a couple of major positives. One, and it was rather ignored in the first couple of weeks of his administration. It's quite interesting. The very first thing he did was the deregulatory effort. And you may recall it was within about 3 or 4 weeks, maybe 6 weeks, he gathered small business people into the Oval Office, and he said, the significance of this was absolutely lost on the media elite, the professional class, all across the country for not just his supporters, but for small business people. Mm-hmm. This was a huge, huge statement because most people, our family business being a small business, but I know many people in this situation, the last 20 to 30 years have been a time of endless additional regulation, endless additional forms you have to fill out, endless additional fees you have to pay if you fail to pay the form or fill out the form. This is also part of it. So there's been a coercive feel, a net of regulation laid on. It hasn't been severe enough to destroy it. I'm not suggesting that. It's not a conspiracy to destroy small business, but for those engaged in small business, and they are, after all, the majority of people outside of the Northeast in small little firms, businesses, delis, restaurants, right? This is huge. So I think that was when people talk about the economic revival, it was a revival of the spirits. People began to feel like, oh my God, the regulatory state is being pushed back for a change rather than pushed forward. Mm-hmm. And this is positive. So that I think we cannot take away. That was major. But the biggest thing he did, and I think again we will look back, it's ironic to say it in the midst of so much happening now, is that an enormous part of America that ever since, and I used the word before, the silent majority, ever since the Nixon years we talked about a silent majority, they have felt more and more disenfranchised. They have felt more and more on the sidelines. Their kids don't go to Ivy League schools. They do not listen to ABC, NBC, CBS. They do not participate. We call them the red state, but it's not just the red state. It's everywhere. Mm-hmm. And those people were feeling, even in some cases when you went into places like Texas, genuine secessionist feelings were developing. Genuine. I mean, it wasn't really amounting to anything, but they were talking like this. They felt so. Trump is their champion. Trump is their guy in the White House. They feel like, oh my God, we're on the lever. Our hand is on the levers of power. And that's the first time they felt that since Nixon. And even with Nixon, they weren't sure he was on their side. They always thought he was kind of playing them a little bit, which he was maybe to some extent. He still was Nixon was still the scion of the Northeast, much as he portrayed it otherwise. I mean, it was the bankers, Wall Street backed Nixon. Trump is not. I mean, he is really outside that. And I think that their enfranchisement, if you will, has been a major, major thing. It has brought the country, believe it or not, I would say it's brought the country together, meaning a large number of people who felt disenfranchised feel part of it. Now, that's why this, just to jump to today, the statue issue, the Confederate statuary issue has to be handled so carefully.
Yeah.
Because, it's not that everybody is a Southern sympathizer, but all of the people I'm talking about, the sort of who see Trump as their patron, if you will, or to see part of their history, the history of the United States I'm talking about, not their history of Southerners, but just the history suppressed in this way is dangerous. What would be much better to be doing, and I hope we get there, is some kind of what they called in South Africa reconciliation commission, which will go case by case and look at which of these statues should be changed or taken down, or perhaps which of these statues should be aligned with another statue. In other words, you can have a statue in Arlington Cemetery. What happened last night is this bill that Warren put forward, which now has passed the Senate, and unless Trump vetoes it, will become law. The monument to Confederate veterans at Arlington National Cemetery will be taken down. Now, I think that's a huge mistake. How do you, but there's a way to handle it. Next to the monument to Arlington to the soldiers who died for the Confederacy, you could have a monument to those soldiers, Black soldiers who died in the service of the Union. In other words, there's things you could do to ameliorate this rather than just removing it. And so I think that it's something we're going to have to take very carefully. I will not be surprised if Trump vetoes that bill, but if he does, it'll just be thrown back to Congress to kind of work it out. It was not thought on the part of the Democrats.
Why do you think that a significant portion of the population wants or requires any kind of positive acknowledgement of the leaders of the Confederacy?
I don't think it's acknowledgement. It's just acknowledgement of fallen American soldiers.
I see.
I don't think they're not believe. It's not that they believe in slavery but to think that a cemetery like Arlington, which is our national cemetery, would remove a monument to. I mean, I think that is going to. It is hurtful. It's hurtful and unnecessarily so. And if the people who I was surprised Warren proposed that. I mean, she's a thoughtful person, and I would think that rather than tear it down, the answer is to try and create some kind of memorial space that recognizes everything. We have a wonderful example of this, which is the Vietnam War Memorial, which is really quite an extraordinary monument that was created out of all that divisiveness. A very moving memorial was made, which really pays not just tribute to the fallen, but tribute to the crisis and to the great divisiveness of the time. It's not a triumphalist monument.
How would you apply this to the taking down of the Jefferson Davis Memorial?
The Thomas Jefferson Memorial?
The Jefferson Davis Memorial.
Jefferson Davis. Which one are we referring to now? The statue at Statuary Hall?
I think a statue is being taken down or was taken down in Virginia recently as part of this controversy.
Oh. Well, I think we're probably talking about, there's the statue in the Capitol, which he and Stevens, the vice president of the Confederacy, were both senators.
Yeah.
And to my mind, they should be left in the Statuary Hall with simply a notation that they were both, a proper identification. But since they were senators, I think they should remain. I don't see why that can't be accommodated. As to the statue, I think you're referring to the one on Monument Avenue in Richmond, which of course has Monument Avenue. And I even remember this as a child, oddly enough, visiting a relative there. Monument Avenue at every intersection has the principal Confederate generals. Right. And that's I think you remove it from a prominent space like Monument Avenue, and you place it more similar to what the Soviets have done with statues from the Soviet era. If you want an odd analogy, they've created a park where these statues are left, not defaced, not, sometimes with social comment, but basically as history. You don't try and obliterate your history. You don't necessarily put it in the middle of Red Square either. I mean, they're coming to this very slowly with the removal of Lenin's tomb eventually. That's going to have to happen. And that's going to be a sort of a similar thing. But Jefferson Davis, yes, I think they should be removed, but not in this way. You see, there should be, what I think Congress should have passed is a bill to establish a reconciliation commission, and the commission could then make decisions on which statues to go where.
Isn't there some, I'm going to try to make a counter argument just to see how you respond to it. Isn't there some acknowledgement of the legitimacy of the position that those people took by keeping them in three-dimensional form at all?
Yes, I think it is, but you have to recognize they took those positions because they were defending what they believed was their country. I mean, it is constantly said, this word states' rights is used all the time. The Confederacy was obviously, to my mind, fighting for slavery. I mean, they wanted the slave system. It was important to the aristocracy of the South. There's no question. But along with that, how do you explain a state like Tennessee, where one of these generals comes from? I think Hood comes from Tennessee. I could be wrong. Tennessee had virtually no slavery. These were small farmers. It was a hillbilly land, even in the time of the Civil War. They were fighting because they thought they were resisting an invasion. So I think I see what you're saying, but I don't think you can paint with too broad a brush, all of the people who supported the Confederacy.
Okay. So where do we go from here, in your view? What would you propose going forward?
Well, Larry, when you wrote me this email about what you're doing here, I think efforts like this on the individual level, as reaching out to people as much as you can, bringing the decibel level down. I mean, the decibel level on our news programs is just, it's almost inaudible. You cannot listen to it without being pushed in one direction or another. We need to do just what you're doing here. I mean, I will go so far as to say I don't really think that, the idea that the country's in terrible shape, I don't agree. I think the country is, millions and millions of people are going about their jobs every day. I was talking to someone yesterday and they were bemoaning the fate of the country. I said, then go to a supermarket, go to a fair, go to a park, watch people entertaining themselves with their families. Millions and millions of people are just going about their lives, despite the body blow of the COVID and the lockdown and this. They're just going about. Most people in this country are preparing for an election. Most people are just simply saying, I'm going to register my decision by who I vote for. I think you probably will see that that's more the Trump people than the Democrats. The Trump people are quietly removing themselves from the fracas, and they're just quietly going out there and getting ready to vote for Trump. I'm speaking to you from a district that last year went red to blue, the 22nd Congressional. I have seen Trump signs in probably 5 or 6 locales, prominent Trump displays in the county. I've not seen one single sign for Biden, not one. And so what does that tell me? Not necessarily that Trump's going to win by a landslide or not, but that the population, that the silent majority is indeed goes kind of silent. They feel that they don't have a voice in mainstream media. They feel they will not be listened to in mainstream media. So they just quietly go about their jobs. And when the day comes, they're going to vote. And I can't really predict the way it will go, although I think right now It's too early to be absolutely sure, but it seems to me that it's very 50-50. And if I had to weight it slightly, I think Trump has a slight edge, because I think the Democrats are making some big mistakes in not separating themselves from the violence of the protesters. But there's time to fix that, and they may fix that.
Mhm. So what is your view of the media and how it should change?
I don't think it can change. I think the media, what we have are two medias out there, and they're almost equal. If you look at the viewerships, what's different is that Fox News has a very concentrated readership. Tucker Carlson, Laura Ingraham, and a few other people attract way and away the biggest audiences in the US. Only Rachel Maddow comes close to either one of those. On the other hand, if you look at ABC, CBS, you look at the grouping, CNN, they're roughly like two equal, they're really like the Montagues and the Capulets. They both battle at each other. They both distort to extraordinary degree, sometimes almost comically. I don't know if you saw this thing about CNN did a poll a couple of weeks ago, and they announced that Biden had a 12-point lead or some such thing over Trump. Mm-hmm. Well, now, people picked apart the poll and they find out that of the people interviewed, and of course, it's always a very small sample, only 25% were registered Republicans. Mm-hmm. So you see how, these are silly things to engage in. Whereas if you look at the Rasmussen poll, which is, I find, probably one of the few that one can depend on, done a couple days ago, after all the tumult about the Black Lives Matter movement, 40% of respondents who identified as Black said they would vote for Trump. Uh-huh. So you see, you've got two camps talking at each other without there's something. So you can't change that. There's too much money involved. There's too many careers invested in this. You can't really change it, at least not immediately. It's going to take a lot of time. But what you're doing is the counterpoint, because people have to find sources of news and opinion that are not so biased, and they will. I think the internet. One thing that's amazing to me is that if we didn't have the internet today, we'd be in a much, much more difficult position. The internet has given everybody a platform, but as a consequence, media as a whole has lost its pull on many, many people. I grew up, you probably remember the same. We listened to Walter Cronkite, and if it was said on CBS, people absolutely believed it. And they probably were right to believe it. CBS was very credible. But, now it's somewhat different.
So I think we should wind this down because it's been almost 45 minutes. Do you have any other thoughts that you'd like to share on, I think more on how we could improve our chances of greater harmony going forward?
Well, as I say, I'm optimistic when I look at the cycles of history that we are, term you used originally, we are in a disruptive cycle, and we should simply recognize it as a disruptive cycle. Don't try and squash it. Let the voices bubble up. Mm-hmm. The United States has this, astonishing ability to take disruption and turn it into renewed strength. It's done it before many times. It befuddles our critics around the world. They can't really understand. To them, chaos equals destruction. Yeah. And we are much closer to the idea that chaos equals recreation. Yeah. And so I think it's tremendously important to be optimistic, not because you're a Pollyanna, but because you say, realistically, we've been here before. We're going to go through this again. And new leaders will appear. I'm not sure they've appeared yet, but they will. And, above all, we have to see the big picture, if you will. And the big picture, I was talking to someone yesterday and they were bemoaning again the fate of the US. I said, have you ever seen, look, we sit in comfortable living rooms. We have technology. We have no concerns about feeding ourselves. We have and we debate the future. It's almost like, I mean, and most of us are not working in traditional 9-to-5 jobs, and yet we're still getting by. We can't do this forever, but we are getting by. Even people who've lost jobs in the whether the blue collar sector are being cushioned by an extraordinary effort, the CARES Act, to give them financial support. By the way, I have to bring that up. Anyone who says to you, "Oh, the disunity in the United States is so terrible," I say, you know what? The CARES Act passed unanimously. Unanimously. In the midst of one of the most bitter and divisive moments in American history, the CARES Act passed unanimously.
Do you think another CARES Act or an extension of the CARES Act is needed, or do you think we'll be on time? Or
No. I think now. I think yes. I think we have to extend probably most of the CARES Act provisions. For instance, unemployment, the additional unemployment benefit that people are getting. I think that should be extended at least 2 or 3 months, because we will not see a real, I mean, that gives time to see if a vaccine can be developed. And until a vaccine is developed, it's going to be very hard to get a lot of people back into work. And it's going to be very hard to get customers back into the businesses, even if people get back into work.
Okay,